All right. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Modern Cyber Podcast, brought to you by FireTail, leaders in API security. Find us online at FireTail.io. Please remember to rate, like, subscribe, share with your friends, etc. I am delighted to be joined by somebody who really doesn't need much of an introduction, especially if you work in the cybersecurity space. I'm sure it's a very well-known name, but I am joined today by Sounil Yu. Sounil is the co-founder at Knostic AI, spelled Knostic.ai. And previously, Sounil was the CISO and head of research at JupiterOne, as well as chief security scientist at Bank of America, among other cybersecurity leadership roles. Sounil is a well-known name, as I said, in the cybersecurity space. He created the Cyber Defense Matrix and the DIE Triad, which are reshaping approaches to cybersecurity. I know I find them incredibly informative and helpful in terms of just shaping some product direction and things that we're doing over here at FireTail. I hope all of you are actually referring to them. Sounil has an MS in electrical engineering from Virginia Tech, a BS in electrical engineering, and a BA in economics from Duke University. And just by way of disclosure, before we dive into today's conversation, Sounil Yu is an advisory board member at FireTail. Sounil, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I wanted to get your take on something that I know you posted about recently, and I think it's something that a lot of people, myself included, were kind of wondering your thoughts about, and that is the update to the cybersecurity framework that just came out from NIST. I know from having talked to you offline that some of the things in NIST were part of a framework that you used in your own mental model that you used to derive the the cyber defense matrix. So I'm just kind of curious. I mean, first of all, what was your reaction to the update? Anything super significant or meaningful in there that really caught your attention?
Well, meaningful. Let me kind of give you my original perspective. If I look at CSF version 1/1.1 as one dimension, that would have been the 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? What I was hoping for in version 2 is the second dimension, which is what the cyber defense matrix is, right? So having some sort of articulation of the other dimension, but that's okay. I think in the context of I was talking to Sherry over at NIST just earlier this week, and I can appreciate the trade-offs that they have. There's a lot of stakeholders that they have to wrestle with, and because it's NIST, one little change that they make has massive impact across big parts of the industry. So I sympathize with the challenge that they're dealing with, and these small little. I imagine that these changes have to be really well thought through to understand what is the downstream impact. All that said, I absolutely do have opinions about the latest edition, and of course the biggest addition is the function of govern that they added. And my biggest challenge with that particular edition is that the problem with the term govern relative to those functions is a problem of altitude.
Okay.
So what I mean by altitude is if I look at the cyber defense matrix as, let's say, the map of the United States, with all the different. If I look at it as a state level map, governance might be more like a country level map. Okay. And so you're looking at it from a 50,000 foot view versus, let's say, a 10,000 foot view. And I would say when you start putting in principles that operate at different tiers or different altitudes, you start confusing the audience and people around. Wait, what altitude are you actually talking about? Let me give you another example. Using maps again. The words for directions. Okay, so I ask you for directions. What are the words that you use to describe directions? Well, if I were in your house, the words that you would use for directions wouldn't be east, north, south, west.
Right. Up the stairs, turn left, second door on the right.
Right. If you were looking on a city map, you wouldn't say up the stairs. You wouldn't even say like.
And by the way, I wouldn't use north-south. I'd say go that way 2 blocks, turn right, maybe give you a landmark or something like that. Yeah.
So in the same way for cybersecurity, we have this word risk.
Yeah.
And how you describe risk at a 10-foot level is very different than how you describe the words I use to describe risk at the 50,000-foot level. And so likewise, in the context of the cyber security framework, if you start commingling things like governance, which I think is at a higher level than the functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, then we start confusing, wait, who are we speaking to? What language are we talking at? What do you mean by left? Because that's not even in my vocabulary.
Right.
Okay. So that's the challenge. Now, if there's a clean mapping between the function of governance or the activity of governance with all the other subfunctions of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, then you can say, oh, okay, in the country of the United States, there's 50 states, and these 50 states are as such, and there's a translation function that we can naturally see in the physical world, of course. But in the cyber world, we're still kind of figuring out, like, wait, what are we talking at the state level? Are we talking at the city level?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But to your point, I mean, doesn't that also in a way kind of imply a secondary dimension? Because govern is not really one of these sequential activities like identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. You know, it is kind of something that overlies all of them. And it is something that should be like you're doing it at every step along the way. And so to that extent, it's kind of a second dimension, or do you not really see it that way? You see it as just kind of a zoom in, zoom out lens on those things.
Well, not a second dimension, but a third dimension, right?
Okay.
You look at the world.
Sorry. Yeah. Not
right?
A second dimension. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yes, I do see governance as, or different layers. There's, DoD has what's called their architectural framework, DODAF.
Yeah.
And in the architectural framework, they have all these different types of views. They have a technical view. They have a operational view. They have there's like 7 different views.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. AWS has their well-architected framework. And similarly, you know, it has a cost view and an efficiency view and a resiliency view and a security view and so on.
Right. So you look at a physical map and you see a political map. You see a terrain map. You see a weather map, right? So you have all these different types of representations at different layers as well. And so I look at governance as one of those types of, I mean, it's like a political terrain map, a political map versus, let's say, an analytics view.
Yeah.
Okay. An analytics view might be a weather map.
Or a traffic map or something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And where does analytics fit across the matrix or across these functions? It fits everywhere, right? Every aspect of the matrix, every aspect of governance and whatever. There's measurement and there's analytics that we can do on top of all that. So where's the home for that? And the reality is it kind of transcends that physical. Anyway, it provides that another layer of abstraction. Yeah. And that's the challenge with the function of governance, because then I can also say, well, if you add governance, then where's analytics, right?
Yeah.
Where's all these other maps that we kind of need to be able to run and operate a good security program?
It brings me to like 3 follow-up questions that come to my mind. Number one is, through my work in cloud security, governance is a term that got used in like many different ways. And pretty much every customer that we went into to talk about governance had a different view on what governance was. Mm-hmm. But I would say the one kind of common thread, if I had to pull one out from X number of customers that I worked with over the years of what governance is it really is we're doing things the way that we intend them to be done. And that could be as simple as, let's say on a cloud platform, we run production in US East Northern Virginia, and we run disaster recovery in US East Ohio region. And we use a certain set of services from these cloud providers, nothing else. And everything that we stand up has to have a certain set of labels or tags on it, so we know how to identify every asset that we're running. And for many organizations, first of all, that was a challenge. They often had challenges getting people to abide by those rules, but they often also had challenges even kind of codifying those rules or expressing where they fit, to your point, into a cybersecurity program. And so do you think of governance as this kind of set of governance is like a set of guidelines for how we, organization X, intend to do things? Or do you think we should think about it differently?
So the way I thought about it is governance, at least in the context of the cyber defense matrix, creates the structure of the matrix itself.
Okay.
The governance, in my view, provides a way to understand how people, process, and technology operate in this environment. And then one can use governance functions to say, is it operating as expected, right? But I love the analogies because it does help me process the world. There's different types of governance, even on a map, so to speak, right? You have federal government, you have state government, you have local government.
Yeah.
Do they all exist at different, they exist at different layers, and they may have different forms of government as well, or governance as well. You can have a democratic government and a Republican state and a Marxist local government, whatever. Okay.
Right.
And so, in fact, there's this notion that every person has multiple political affiliations. You could be, at the federal level, a Democrat, a state level, a Republican, at the family level, a communist, and a Marxist with your dog. Okay. So anyway, the point is that at different scales, you have different types of governance constructs, and they look different, but the notion of structure is still the same. Meaning, you have these bodies of these governing bodies, and the structure of these governing bodies have a self-similarity throughout the different structures. So similarly, the cyber defense matrix to me is creating that governance structure under which we can understand how people, process, and technology fit.
One of the things I really like about the cyber defense matrix model is that you underlie all of those functions with the kind of I don't know what the right word for the diagram is, but it shows which activities are very heavily people driven and which activities are very heavily technology driven, and they kind of bleed together as you go across the spectrum. I'm curious. So when you say governance kind of fits that, is it kind of fair to say that, let's say, if I sample an activity in there like detect, governance to me says, okay, my detect approaches should be 60% technology driven, 40% human, just picking random numbers. Mm-hmm. And for various attack surfaces that I'm covering, or various asset types as you have in the matrix, just checking that we're applying the right levels of technology versus the right levels of human interaction for the attack surfaces that we've defined that we want our approach to be. That's governance.
Governance provides that structure,
right,
to define then what we consider to be optimal or efficient or desirable, or whatever else it is.
And then tests against that would be kind of checks that we are actually complying with the governance that we as an organization have set forth.
Right. And the bottom part of it is around the resource allocation. The matrix itself, the 555 matrix, is to say, what are we doing in each of these boxes? And are we doing what we should be doing in each of these boxes? There's a governance aspect because you've now created that structure that says these are things that need to be done.
Yeah. And just a reminder to our listeners, as you once told me, it's not a bingo blackout card. You're not trying to check every box on the cyber defense matrix.
That's right.
Unless you're, maybe way out, a severe outlier in terms of what your defense needs are, your cyber defense needs are. I'm curious.
But at the same time,
go ahead.
The goal of the matrix was to bring awareness to the fact that there exists these functions, there exist these assets, and you should see whether or not it's relevant for you to do something about those boxes.
Yeah.
In the same way, when I was talking to Sherry over at NIST, I think part of the goal was to say, look, folks, don't forget about governance. Let's explicitly call out governance so that people don't forget about it.
Yeah.
That was partly my goal with the cyber defense matrix, to say, hey, folks, when you say cyber, don't forget that cyber includes not just the devices you use, but the applications, but and also the networks and the data and the users. Don't forget that those are all things that need to be identified, protected, detected, respond, recovered. And so it was a way to just remind ourselves, don't forget these things. don't
Yeah.
forget that this is
Yeah.
not just about technology, but it also includes people, process as well.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what I think part of the goal of NIST was with the governance function is to say, hey, don't forget there's governance too.
Yeah.
For me, I would say, okay, great. I agree with that principle, but if it's operating at this higher level, then I would say at that higher level, there's not just governance, there's also things like analytics, there's orchestration, there's um, automation. There's all these things that we should consider at this more higher level of abstraction that includes governance, but it's not only governance. And right
Yeah.
now, we will forget about these other things because all we see on that diagram is governance.
Well, this brings me to one of the other questions that I mentioned earlier. I said I had three. So the second one that I have is in other contexts where I've talked to customers about governance, one of the questions that I very often get, or one of the reactions that I get is, well, governance means hygiene. And hygiene is kind of, are we running the things that we intend to run? And many organizations find that they have a lot of sprawl, that they have lots more systems running than they thought because old project X never got decommissioned, old server Y never got shut down. Cloud instances 1 through 350 are still running outside of their production hours, et cetera. And I found that people would, when I would ask people about hygiene, or either I would ask them about governance and they would jump to hygiene, or I'd ask them about hygiene and they would say, oh, that's part of our governance function. And it would get pushed to a separate set of individuals than, for instance, potentially the cyber team. They would say, oh, that's the GRC team, governance risk compliance. They're responsible for that. And so there was this kind of weird conflation of those two terms that I experienced. It sounds like from your perspective, they're definitely not the same thing, although there is some connected nature of hygiene, feeding governance or maybe being like a rule set within governance. But how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would not actually put hygiene and governance and equate them to be, or say that um, hygiene is governance is more than just hygiene.
Right.
Is what I was going to say. And by the way, just to give you context, the term hygiene is also oftentimes misunderstood. And one way to have a clearer understanding of what we mean by hygiene is by considering the word safety.
Yeah.
So in many other languages, the word for safety and security are the same word.
The same. Yeah.
In English, we have two words.
Yeah.
In cybersecurity, we seem to have the same word again.
Yeah.
Okay. But what do we mean by safe? What's the word safety mean in cyber? Well, one way to think about it is to add the word food in front of it. So what is food safety? Well, food safety includes hygiene, compliance, inspections, best practices. Sounds a lot like what we call cybersecurity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Then there's something separate called cybersecurity or food security. And food security is something that there's concerns around food security that is triggered from like things like famine, or what happened to all the baby formula, or what are we going to do about all the Ukrainian wheat and getting it out there, right? And that they're usually incident driven, in my view. And what we try to do is to prepare for those incidents. And when we think about good governance, to me, it's both the safety and the security side of it. Okay. And the safety side, again, is the hygiene part. But what we call security, what I'm calling security, is what do you do when something bad happens? And how do you ensure that you have good governance to ensure that when something inevitably bad happens, you know how to prepare for it. You've been prepared for it so that you can then make that not material.
Yeah. And the third question that kind of came up in my mind when I looked at this is governance is a concept, and it's very hard to kind of define a set of prescriptive controls around it. And I think for a lot of people, especially a lot of, let's say, younger or less mature cybersecurity practices, one thing that I find them consistently struggle with is they're often looking for prescriptive, because absent good awareness of a threat model and a strategy for kind of responding to the appropriate threat model for that, which, by the way, again, I think the cyber defense matrix does a good job of bringing awareness to kind of asking yourself, all the right questions about where your risks might be and where you might want to apply mitigations and defenses. So a plug for that again. But absent that, a lot of people look at things like this and they say like, well, I'm just going to follow the NIST CSF. But you don't find a lot of prescriptive controls in there. And I think that's an often cited criticism of something like the CSF. What's your reaction to that? And also from your times as a practitioner in larger organizations, like, did you look at things like the CSF for controls, or did you look at them as just, hey, guidance that we need to check in on and see what we think about it, and, just ask ourselves a set of questions again, are we doing all the things we think we should be doing?
Yeah. And so let me again use the map analogy for a moment. Oftentimes when people are asking for a very tactical level control, and they look at the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is again at a much higher level, then they're communicating already in the wrong level. They're expecting things at the wrong level. And for the cyber defense matrix, again, I think to me it's at this higher abstraction that makes it really hard for us to say, give me a tactical level control that fits in this particular box. And I can give you that, but then you're asking for something that's at this very low level. You started off this conversation around controls for governance. So let me give you then the analogy there, because this will also help as well. So if the cyber defense matrix and how we represent the program is at the 50,000 foot level or whatever, then the board of directors is something like at the 100,000 or 250,000 foot level. Okay. And the controls that you operate at that level are very different than the kind of controls that you operate at the 50,000 foot level. At the board of directors level, and what's the job of the board of directors? Governance.
Yeah.
Okay. What are the controls that we have for board of directors? Well, there are laws, whether from the SEC or Sarbanes-Oxley, that says you are expected to exercise your governance functions in such a way that if you don't do it properly, you can be sued, or you can be held personally liable for failing to do your proper corporate governance functions. That's the control.
Yeah. I think that is a great note to leave today's conversation on. Sounil, I appreciate your thoughts on the cybersecurity framework, how it ties into the cyber defense matrix, and how organizations could think about governance. Thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today on Modern Cyber.
Thanks for having me.